They ask me in debrief why I kept the wrist guard. I tell them it's evidence. That's the polite version. The real version is that I kept it because the 5 marks inside the cuff are the only thing I have that proves I wasn't imagining what happened in Kethavar. And on nights when the memory decides to be vivid again, I hold it in my hands and count the scratches with my thumbnail and feel my pulse drop. The marks are not decorative. They are not a ritual. They are a record. I was there, I counted, I made 5 marks and I walked out. Everything between the first mark and the last is the story I am going to tell you now. My name is Marin Voss. At the time of Kethavar, I held the rank of Forward Scout, first tier, attached to the 44th Composite Survey and Engagement Group, Kashul IV Theater. I had been scouting for 11 years. I want to say that clearly before I go any further, because the events I am going to describe will sound like the account of someone who lost their nerve. And I want it on record that I have never lost my nerve in 11 years. Not on Kashul II when the Gret Pack cornered my team in a drainage channel, and I held point for 4 hours while Specialist Terran bled through 2 field dressings, and we waited for the extraction burn. Not on the Vethorak Shelf when comms went dark for 6 days, and we navigated by dead reckoning across terrain that had last been surveyed by a mapping team that had subsequently not returned. Not once in 11 years have I been in a situation where the fear got to the front of the line before the thinking did. I say this not to sound impressive. I say it because what the Vethali did to Casserly's counterpart in Bravo Element and to the others they found was not a failure of nerve on those soldiers' parts. They were not afraid. They were simply moving, and moving was the wrong thing to do, and they did not know that yet, and neither did I until I watched. I want to start there, with the watching and with the city, because the city itself is part of this. We entered Kethavar from the southwestern transit corridor at 0744 local, which is to say mid-morning by Kashul IV's reckoning, which is to say full bright daylight through a sky that was cloudless, and the color of old brass, that particular yellow-amber that Kashul IV's primary produces through its own particular atmospheric composition, and which takes about 2 weeks to stop looking wrong to eyes calibrated for Sol Standard blue. The light was heavy and horizontal at that hour, coming in low from the east and catching the edges of everything it touched. Kethavar had been a trade hub city. If you have seen the survey photographs from before the Vethali came through, the ones taken by the Kashul IV Territorial Survey, archived in the contact files from the initial outreach period, you know what it looked like. Tall, narrow towers in a pale terracotta stone that had been quarried from the eastern range and dressed by hand by whatever population had built this place. Streets wide enough for freight convoys moving in opposing directions simultaneously. A central market district that the Kashul IV contacts had described to our advanced team as the loudest place on the planet, and they had meant it as a compliment, as an advertisement, as an invitation. Come and be part of the noise. Come and trade. By the time we arrived, it was none of that. The towers were still standing mostly, but they had been opened, cracked along their vertical axes by some kind of low-frequency resonance. The Vethali deploy when they move through a built environment, a specific application of the same bioelectric sensing capacity that makes them dangerous, running in a different mode, pitched not to read signals but to produce them, to find the structural resonances of enclosed spaces and amplify them until the walls comply. The upper floors of many buildings had simply spread apart at the top like a book left face down, the interior floors and walls exposed to the sky in long pale strips of dusty terracotta, and the darker material of whatever insulation or infrastructure had been sandwiched inside. The streets were bright. The sun came in from directly overhead and from the sides both, through the open buildings, and the rubble caught and scattered it until the whole place was luminous and shadowless in a way that felt wrong, in a way I could not have articulated at the time and can only articulate now. Ruins are supposed to be dark. You expect ruins to produce shadows, the heavy collapsed geometry shadows of fallen things, and Kethavar in full daylight produced almost none. The rubble was pale and the scattered light was diffuse, and the whole city read as overexposed, too bright for its own emptiness. It took me most of the first block to understand why that wrongness was bothering me beyond simple aesthetic discomfort. Shadowless meant directionless. In shadowless light, you cannot tell where the light is coming from. And if you cannot tell where the light is coming from, you cannot tell where anything is coming from. And in the field, that absence of directionality in your environment is a specific kind of vulnerability. The Vethali had unmade the shadows. I do not think that was intentional, but it was the effect. There were 6 of us in the initial penetration team. Myself as lead, Casserly on my left flank approximately 10 meters out, Dorn as rear security 2 positions behind me, and 3 others Scout second-tier Halov, who had 4 years and was careful, Warrant Officer Fen Drauka serving as team medic, and Specialist Orev, our signals technician, who was there specifically to attempt a hardline tap on the comms relay once we reached it. The team was spread across a 70-meter line as we moved up what had been the main freight boulevard, loose enough to avoid clustering, but tight enough that hand signals were readable. Our objective was a comms relay station on the eastern side of the market district. We had a signal coming from it, intermittent, cycling on a period of approximately 4 minutes, which is not the period of any standard survivor beacon, but which the signals specialists had been unable to conclusively identify as Vethali interference bait either. Command had decided the ambiguity needed to be resolved in person. That was our job. Get eyes on the relay, confirm the signal source, report back. If it was a survivor, we extracted them. If it was bait, we logged the pattern and withdrew. It was a reconnaissance tasking, which in my experience is the category of mission most likely to become something else entirely without announcement. Before I get to the sound, I want to say something about the process of moving through a city that has been made wrong, because it is relevant to how I understood what happened, and because I think people who have not done this underestimate how much of scouting is reading the environment rather than reading identifiable threats. A city is full of sounds that tell you what is happening in it. Moving air through windows, through corridors, through the gaps between buildings. The shift and settle of structures cooling or heating as the sun moves. The sounds of whatever organisms have colonized the vacant spaces. And there are always organisms. Within a short time, any abandoned built environment becomes someone's habitat. The nest builders and the feeders and the things that eat what the nest builders leave behind. A living city sounds like itself. A dead city sounds like itself too, but differently. You hear what is absent. You hear the ventilation systems that are no longer running and the foot traffic that is no longer happening and the communication channels that have gone quiet. Kethavar sounded dead in all the ways a city sounds dead, but it also sounded like something else. And I was 400 meters in before I isolated what that something else was. The buildings that had been opened by the Vethali structural resonance were acting as wind instruments. Not deliberately, not by any alien design, just as a consequence of their geometry. The long vertical splits in the tower facades created chambers of specific dimensions, and the wind moving through those chambers at the Kashul IV morning speed was producing tones. Not the same tone in each building, each split was a different length, a different width, the stone a different thickness, but tones, sustained and irregular and layered over each other in a chord that had no root and no resolution, just duration. It was the sound a broken organ would make if someone held down all the keys simultaneously and then walked away. I knew what it was once I had thought about it. But for the first 200 meters it was just wrong. And I was cataloging the wrongness, and cataloging the wrongness was what I was doing when the other sound arrived. We were 400 meters into the city when I first heard it. I need to describe the sound carefully because it is important to the rest of what I am going to tell you, and because I have heard it described inaccurately in several of the accounts that circulated after Kethavar. And the inaccurate descriptions do not help anyone who might encounter it in the future. It was not loud. It was not a sound that registered as a threat at first contact, and not because I was not paying attention. I was paying close attention. I am always paying close attention. That is the job. But because it had no quality that a trained listener would flag as a warning. It was a low, sustained hum, not quite a tone, because a tone has a center frequency and a tone has a shape that locates it in space, and this had neither. It smeared across a range of frequencies, the way certain kinds of tinnitus do, pervasive and directionless, and occupying the low-end register of ambient sound, without displacing anything specific that was already there. The first thing I thought when I heard it was that the structural damage to the buildings was creating some kind of resonant feedback in the wind. The open towers, acting as long vertical chambers, vibrating at their own structural frequencies in whatever light breeze was moving through the city. That was a reasonable first guess. It was wrong, but it was reasonable, and I filed it under monitor and continued moving. We were 230 meters from the relay station when we found the Vethali's earlier work. There had been a fire team here before us. The combat assessment specialists have since determined they were from the Heron Detachment, Bravo Element, which went dark 11 days before our insertion. 6 personnel, a standard contact team, tasked with a similar objective to ours. They had taken cover in the mouth of a side street, where the rubble from a collapsed building facade created a low berm of broken terracotta and twisted composite framing. A reasonable tactical decision. It gave them a good field of view down the boulevard, and a covered retreat route behind them, and overhead cover from a section of floor plate that had not yet completed its fall, and was resting at an angle between 2 walls. The kind of position you take when you are expecting trouble and want to think before you move. They were all still there, all 6 of them. None of them had been moved by anyone or anything in the 11 days since they had stopped moving themselves. I am going to be factual about what we found because the factual account is what went into the report and the report matters, and I have told this part of the story enough times now that I have learned the factual version is also the one people find hardest to dismiss. There was no visible trauma to the bodies, no projectile wounds, no burning, no crush injuries from debris, no blood loss, no environmental exposure damage sufficient to explain death. They appeared, instead, to have died while in the process of doing something. One of them was in a low crouch with her right arm extended forward and slightly downward, her hand open, as if she were pointing at something on the ground or reaching to pick something up from the surface of the rubble. 2 of them were on their feet, mid-stride, 1 foot forward and 1 foot back in the classic opposition of someone walking, frozen in the moment of transfer. The team leader, we identified him by his wrist tag, had his head turned to the left at approximately 45 degrees, his neck rotated, his eyes still open and directed at a point on the boulevard wall to his left, at a height that suggested something at roughly shoulder height had caught his attention. And the one nearest the berm, the one who had presumably been keeping watch on the approach, had both hands on his field scanner in the grip you use when you are lifting a scanner to your eye level to take a reading. He had not completed the lift. The scanner was at mid-chest height. They were all, in other words, caught mid-motion, not mid-combat, not in postures of fear or aggression, mid-motion. The acts themselves were ordinary, standing up from a crouch, walking, turning to look, lifting an instrument, and none of them were completed, and the incompleteness of them was the most disturbing thing about the scene, more disturbing than the deaths themselves. Because completed things, even terrible things, have an end. You can look at something completed and know where it stopped. These had not stopped. They had been stopped from outside, with no cooperation from the people inside them. Our medic, Warrant Officer Fen Drauka, did the individual assessments. She spent approximately 6 minutes with each body, systematic, methodical, not rushing. She was trained for field forensics in addition to trauma medicine. It is a specialization that some medics in the survey groups pick up because the environments we work in produce casualties that are not always the result of engagements we can pre-categorize. When she finished, she came to me and spoke quietly, below the ambient hum, her voice entirely level. She said she believed the cause of death was massive simultaneous systemic failure, cardiac, neural, pulmonary, with an onset so fast that the muscles had not received the signal to stop what they were doing. She said the failure pattern was not one she recognized from standard engagement records. She said she had seen something adjacent to it in the archived medical records from the Veth Basin engagement, the very early ones, before the engagement profile on the Vethali had been significantly developed, in which a certain class of proximity effect had been documented without clear mechanistic explanation, and that the deaths in those records looked like this. She said she thought the Vethali had done this. And then she said something that I want to put in the record exactly as she said it, because she chose her words precisely. She said, "I think they did not do this because these people were running, or because these people were shooting. I think they did this because these people were moving." I asked her if she meant moving toward the Vethali specifically, in the sense of an aggressive or threatening approach. She said, "I don't know, I don't have enough data to say that. I think it may simply be moving. I think the Vethali may respond to the signal that precedes motion regardless of the direction the motion is in. But I don't know. I want to leave." I looked at the bodies for another 30 seconds. I looked at the one in the low crouch with the arm extended and the hand open. I looked at the two mid-stride. I looked at the team leader with his neck at 45 degrees and his eyes still directed at the point on the wall he had been turning to see. I thought about Drauka's word, moving, and I thought about the hum I was still hearing, low and directionless and steady. And I thought about a word that Drauka had not used, but which was assembling itself in my mind from the pieces of what I was looking at. Anticipation. Not motion. Anticipation of motion. The lean of the body before the foot lifts, the shoulder beginning its rotation before the head follows, the arm extending before the fingers have decided what they will do at the end of the extension, the neck beginning its turn before the eyes have confirmed what they are turning toward. These are the things that precede the actions, the physical signals the body sends to itself that the action is coming, and they are not invisible. They are measurable. They produce bioelectric fields. They create subtle but real changes in the tissue's electromagnetic signature in the fraction of a second before the action begins. I thought, what if that fraction of a second is what it reads? I did not say this out loud. I was not certain enough to say it out loud, and in any case the hum changed before I could say anything. Casserly was on my right. He had been watching the bodies and watching the boulevard and watching me in the way that a scout with 8 years watches a situation that has exceeded its parameters, quietly, economically, reserving judgment but cataloging everything. He said we should pull back to the transit corridor and report what we had found and request guidance from command before proceeding. It was the correct thing to say. It was what the protocol called for. We had found evidence of a significant threat of unknown capability and unknown current position. We had not yet completed our objective, and the standard response to that situation is withdrawal and report, not continuation. I was about to agree with him. The hum changed. It did not get louder and it did not shift frequency. What changed was its directionality, or rather, the arrival of directionality where none had existed. For the 12 minutes I had been hearing it, it had been uniformly ambient, present equally from every bearing. What changed was that it stopped being uniform. It became present to the north and east and less present to the south and west, and that gradient was very slight, the kind of gradient you only catch because you have been listening carefully for 12 minutes and you know what the uniform baseline sounds like, but it was real. And it meant the source was moving, and the direction of motion was toward us. I said, everyone hold position. I said it at a conversational volume, and with the same flatness I use when I am reading coordinates back to confirm them. No edge in it, no urgency in the prosody, because in 11 years I have learned that the voice is a signal as much as anything else. And a team in a stressful situation responds to the quality of the voice before they have processed the semantic content of the words. And if the voice carries urgency, they will move before they have thought about whether moving is correct. And I did not want them to move. I said hold position, and I said it the way you say the calibration reads good, flat and specific and signaling that the situation is within the parameters the team already understands, and they held. The hum grew, still from the north. I estimated the source was 300 meters out, possibly less. I raised my left hand flat palm toward the team, stay, and I watched the boulevard to the north. And then I saw it. The Vethali are not large. I want to put this in the record because the descriptions that circulated after Kethavar, and I have read most of them, the informal ones that spread through the mess halls and the transit bays before the formal engagement briefings caught up, described them as enormous, as if their scale were the primary threat, and that is not accurate, and it misdirects people who are trying to prepare. The one I saw moving through the rubble to the north of our position was perhaps 2 meters at the shoulder, large for a biped, which it broadly was, though the leg count was 4, and the arrangement was not what we typically call bipedal, but not the towering thing the rumors described. What was exceptional was not the size. What was exceptional was the motion. It moved the way water moves through an irregular channel, continuously, without interruption, without the rhythmic give and take that vertebrate locomotion is built on. I have watched a great many things move in the field, from Gretpack sprints to the slow territorial procession of the Kashul IV bovids, and all of them share the underlying structure of locomotion that I am used to. A controlled sequence of committed positions, weight shifting, contact with the ground, push-off, recovery, repeat. Even things that move very smoothly still have that underlying pulse if you look carefully enough. The Vethali did not. The 4 legs operated with a complete independence from each other, each one finding its placement in the rubble and committing to it as a settled thing, while the other 3 did their own finding, so that at no point was any leg in the process of transitioning between states. There was no mid-swing, no airborne recovery phase, no moment of vulnerability between contact and contact. The body remained absolutely level. The head did not bob. The torso did not sway. It moved across irregular rubble terrain as if the terrain were flat, because the leg system was absorbing all the irregularity before it reached the body. I understood watching it that it had not evolved this way to move fast or to be impressive. It had evolved this way to produce no vibration in its own tissue, no oscillation in the body mass, no rhythmic pressure variation in the bioelectric field. Whatever the surface tissue was reading in its environment, it would not be confused by its own movement, because its own movement produced nothing that resembled what it was reading for. It moved to the site where the Heron Bravo team had died, and it stopped there. Its head, I am using that word loosely, the structure was more distributed than our equivalent, a forward extension of the torso with sensory organs dispersed across its surface, rather than clustered at a forward point, was oriented toward the area where the bodies were, not because there was anything visible to see there that required orientation. They were dead and had been dead for 11 days and were not moving or signaling or producing anything a visual system would flag. But the orientation of the head and the specific quality of its attention, and I mean this precisely, there was a quality to the stillness of the head that read as attention rather than as mere direction, suggested that it was reading something there. Something that the Heron team had put into the air or the ground, or the very composition of the rubble in the moments before they died, and that was still present and still legible 11 days later. I thought about what Drauka had said, massive simultaneous systemic failure, an onset so fast the muscles had not received the signal to stop. Whatever signal the Heron team had produced in the moments before the Vethali killed them, the anticipation signals, the pre-movement bioelectric cascade, it had saturated the local environment heavily enough that 11 days later, with 6 bodies that were no longer producing anything. The Vethali was still reading the sight. The Vethali's head turned slowly until it was oriented toward us. We were 40 meters away, in partial cover behind a section of collapsed facade. It had not moved in our direction. It had simply oriented, and I stood there with Casserly to my right and Drauka behind me, and 4 other people whose continued survival was, in this moment, contingent on a hypothesis I had formed while looking at dead bodies and was not at all certain about, and I made a decision. I said in the same flat voice, "Do not move. Do not shift your weight. Keep your breathing even, not held even. Slow exhale if you need to release. Do not anticipate anything." That last instruction was the one I was least confident about as an instruction, because anticipation is not volitional. You do not decide to anticipate. The body produces anticipatory signals before the conscious mind has caught up with what it is anticipating. But I said it because I had nothing better and because it was pointing, however imprecisely, at the thing I was trying to get the team to suppress. Do not load anything. Do not lean toward any action. Be here rather than about to be anywhere. The Vethali moved. Not as a charge. Nothing about the Vethali suggests charging. The motion does not have a gear for urgency, or rather all its gears look the same from the outside, that same continuous even flow. It covered 30 of the 40 meters between us before it stopped. 10 meters. The rubble between us was uneven, broken sections of wall and floor in stacked irregular angles, and it had navigated all of it without any visible adjustment or slowdown. 10 meters and it stopped, and its head oriented toward us, and I heard the hum shift in character, not louder, but more present. The way a sound shifts when it is no longer traveling toward you from a distance, but is originating from very close. At 10 meters I could see the surface clearly. The skin, that word is approximately correct, was a dark matte material, very dark, darker than anything I have seen produced by biological tissue in standard lighting conditions, and it was not reflecting the daylight that was coming in through the opened facades above us. It was absorbing it, and it was not uniform in texture. At 10 meters I could see that it had a fine granular quality, the individual grains visible to the unaided eye, and the grains were in very slow motion against each other. Not dramatically, not the visible writhing of something organic and unsettled, but the almost imperceptible drift of a sand dune over an hour compressed into a moment, a slow reconfiguration of the surface as the grains shifted and resettled. I understood that this was the reading. The surface was in motion because the surface was processing. The grain shift was what sensing looked like at that scale, the physical expression of an organ in active use, and it was oriented at us. I had my hand still raised, palm toward the team. Stay. And I started counting. Not out loud, not in a whisper, internally in the place where you have a voice that does not use your larynx or your lips. 1, 2, 3. Not fast, not the compressed counting of someone trying to get through a number quickly, but slow and even, the way you count when you are timing a chemical reaction or waiting for a delayed detonator to reach its window, when the precision of the count matters more than the speed of it. 4, 5, 6. The counting was not aimed at anything. I had no target number in my head, no threshold I was counting toward. I was simply counting, the way a clock counts. Because a clock has no target either, it counts because that is the one thing it does mechanically and without investment in the outcome. 7, 8, 9. The counting gave the inside of my head something to do that was not anticipating, not reaching, not loading any muscle for any motion. It was occupation without intention. It was the most unremarkable, intention-free mental activity I could access in that moment, and I needed unremarkable. I needed intention-free. 10, 11, 12. The Vethali had not moved. 13, 14, 15. I became aware, at some point around 20, that my left thumb was in contact with the inner surface of my wrist guard. The composite armor cuff at my left wrist, which I have worn with the seam facing inward for the last 9 years after a poorly trimmed edge on a previous model, gave me a scar along the inside of the wrist that still occasionally catches on fabric. The interior surface of the cuff is the rough side, the substrate layer before the outer ballistic coating is bonded, a slightly abrasive matte composite that the manufacturers never bothered to finish because it is not supposed to be visible. I could feel the texture of it against the pad of my thumb, and I was pressing very lightly without having decided to press. Not a grip, a contact. I kept counting. 25, 26, 27. I was aware of the Vethali at 10 meters, of the granular surface shifting slowly in the heavy daylight. I was aware of Casserly to my right. I was aware of the sound of my own blood, which I will not dress up as metaphor. I mean, I was aware of my heartbeat in the way you become aware of it when you are very still and the environment around you is very quiet, as a physical fact, a rhythm. I was counting and I was aware of my heartbeat, and I was aware of the thumb against the rough cuff, and I was, specifically, not anticipating anything, because I was counting and the count was what was happening and the count was not going anywhere. It was just continuing. At approximately 60 counts 1 minute, something in the count felt complete, not because I had reached a goal. I had not set a goal, but the count had a shape to it, the way a sentence has a shape, and at 60 it needed a period. I pressed my thumbnail against the inner surface of the cuff and drew it sideways in a short line, perhaps 8 millimeters, a single groove in the substrate. I felt the slight resistance of the abrasive material and the mild edge of pressure at the thumbnail tip, a sensation that occupied exactly as much of my attention as a single number occupies, small, discrete, present, and then complete. First mark. I started counting again. 1, 2, 3. The Vethali had not moved. What I understood at that point, and what I want to be careful to describe accurately, is that I did not yet know my understanding was correct. I had a hypothesis. The hypothesis was, the Vethali reads pre-movement biological signals, and if I produce no pre-movement biological signals by producing no anticipation of movement, it will not read me as a target. I had chosen counting as a behavior consistent with that hypothesis because counting is the most intention-free, non-motor loading cognitive act I could identify on short notice. But I had been still for approximately 1 minute. The Vethali had been still for approximately 1 minute. The correlation between those two facts was available to me, but not yet evidence of anything. It was possible the Vethali was simply in a rest state. It was possible it had read us and found us insufficient. It was possible it was waiting for something I was unaware of. The hypothesis was still just a hypothesis, and I was counting and holding and waiting. 20, 21, 22. I could see the bodies of the Heron Bravo team from where I was standing. The one in the low crouch with the arm extended was perhaps 6 meters to my left and 3 meters forward at the edge of my peripheral vision. I was not looking at her. I was looking at the Vethali and I was counting. But she was in the frame of what I could see, and the arm extended and the hand open and the motion that had not been completed were in the frame as well. I counted. 40, 50. I pressed my thumbnail against the first mark to feel it again, to confirm it was there, and then moved to clear ground and drew a second line parallel to the first. Second mark. And in the moment after I made the second mark, not because of the mark, I am explicitly not claiming causality, the Vethali's head turned. Away from us, to the southwest. Its head held that orientation for 4 or 5 seconds, the granular surface shifting its slow drift in a new configuration, reading whatever it was reading from that direction. Then it moved, back toward the north, back the way it had come, that same continuous even flow, no acceleration, no deceleration, just motion at its single constant rate. It covered 10 meters in 8 counts, and then it moved behind a section of collapsed facade and was no longer visible, and the hum faded back toward uniform ambience in approximately 30 seconds. I kept counting. I kept my thumb against the cuff. I will not claim that I felt relief when it moved away. I did not feel relief. What I felt was a continuation of the state I was already in, counting, present, not anticipating, and I recognized that the state needed to be maintained until I had more information, which I did not yet have. I did not know where the Vethali had gone. I did not know if there were more of them. I did not know if the hum was going to return directional at any moment, so I counted. 80, 90, 100. When I reached 100, I had been counting for approximately 1 minute 40 seconds since the second mark. I made no third mark at 100 because 100 was not a natural period, not the kind of completion that needed punctuation. I kept counting. 101, 102. I counted past it through the next minute until the count felt complete again. Then the third mark. I am going to try to describe what the inside of those minutes was like, because I have been asked about it in subsequent discussions, and I have not had a satisfactory answer ready. And I think it is important information for anyone who will be in the field, applying what is now called the 5-mark standard, and wants to know what to expect from the inside. It is not peaceful. I want to be clear about that. The fear does not go away. The fear was present throughout, substantial, real, physically present in the way that fear is physically present when the threat is immediate and the options are limited. I knew what the Vethali had done to the Harran team. I knew it was somewhere in the city, and I did not know exactly where. I knew that if any of the 6 people behind me shifted their weight incorrectly, we might all die the way those 6 people had died, in the middle of something ordinary with no time to complete it. The fear was loud. It was making arguments. It was suggesting that we should move, that staying still was its own kind of trap, that the Vethali had only left to circle and would come from a different direction, that the hum was changing again. The counting was louder. This is the most accurate way I know to describe it. The counting did not silence the fear. It did not displace it or argue with it or push it into a corner. It simply occupied more of the available space. Counting is not loud in the way urgency is loud. It is not forceful, but it is consistent, it is uninterrupted, and it is, in a very specific way, louder than everything else in the same space, because it is the most recent thing and it keeps being the most recent thing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each number is the newest thing in the mind, the one at the front, and the fear is there, but it is behind the newest number, and the next number comes before the fear can move to the front, and so the fear stays behind the count while the count keeps going. That is not meditation. That is not calm. That is just counting. It is accessible to anyone who can count to 10, and you do not have to be in a particular mental state to do it, and you do not have to suppress your fear first. You just have to start counting, and you have to trust that the counting is doing something even when you cannot see what it is doing, which is the part that requires something closer to discipline than to calmness. The discipline of continuing a simple act when every other faculty you have is telling you to do something more consequential. 3 marks. Between the third and fourth marks, I became aware of the rest of the team in a different way than I had been aware of them before. For the first 2 marks, I had been aware of them the way you are aware of the elements of a field configuration, their positions, their status, their distance from me, because that awareness is not a decision. It is how a scout is trained to hold space, a continuous low-level processing of position and status that runs alongside whatever else the mind is doing. Casserly was to my right. Drauka was behind me and to the left. Halov was further back, near the rear of the position. Dorn I could not see directly, but I had his last position, and I had the silence of the space where he was, and the silence was the same silence as before, which meant he was still there and still holding. Orev was furthest back, at the point where the alley mouth we were using as partial cover opened toward the transit corridor. 5 people, and I was the 6th, and I had their positions like 6 points on a map inside my head, and I was counting. What changed between the third and fourth marks was that I began to hear them. Not movement. None of them were moving in any way that produced sound. What I began to hear was breath, not the breath of each person, not distinguishable individual breathing patterns, but the collective breath of 6 people trying to breathe as quietly as possible, which has a texture, a soft irregularity of slightly staggered cycles that is not quite silence, but is close enough to it that it does not register until you have been very still for a long time, and the environment has gotten very quiet. 6 people breathing slowly and carefully in an alley in a ruined city, and a Vethali somewhere in the northern rubble, and a hum that was staying ambient and uniform, and me counting. I want to say something about the responsibility of those minutes that I was not asked about in the first debrief and did not volunteer, but which is part of the record I am trying to make here. The counting worked for me because I had arrived at it myself, in real time, from a hypothesis that had formed out of watching and thinking. The team was doing it because I had told them not to anticipate anything, which was as close as I could get to the instruction in the moment, and because Casserly at least had independently arrived at counting on his own. But Halov had 4 years. Orev was a signals specialist, not a scout. He had been attached to us specifically for the relay mission, and his field experience was not of this kind. Dorn was a solid scout, but he was rear security, and he was behind me, and I could not see him, and I did not know what he was doing in his head in the absence of any instruction more specific than hold position. They were holding. The breath was calm. The positions were unchanged. Whatever each of them was doing in their own interior space, counting, thinking of nothing, thinking of something specific, repeating something to themselves, they were holding, and the hum was staying ambient, which meant that whatever they were doing was working. Not because of me. Because they were trained and they were present and they were doing the job in conditions that had no protocol, and they were doing it well. I counted, I watched the northern rubble, I listened to 6 people breathe. It was a small shift. The kind the body makes when a muscle held static for too long reaches a threshold, and the reflex adjusts before the conscious mind has caught up with it. I have done it myself, in observation hides, when I have been holding a position for longer than the position was designed for. The body is not built for absolute stillness. It is built for movement, and it will find ways to move that do not feel like decisions. This is a physiological fact and not a failure of discipline, and I am saying that clearly because I do not want what happened next attributed to a failure on Dralka's part. She was not negligent. She was human. The hum spiked. Directional in under 2 seconds. North, strong and moving. I said Finn, count. 2 words. I said them at the same volume and flatness I had been using for everything else, which took the specific discipline I mentioned. The discipline of not letting the urgency reach the voice even when the urgency is entirely justified. 2 words. And Dralka, who had heard me say hold position at the start of this and had heard me tell the whole team not to anticipate, understood what I meant in the way that a trained professional understands a 2-word instruction from a team lead during an active situation. She understood it as a whole behavioral direction, not just a literal command. Count. Stop producing whatever signal you are producing and produce a different one. She understood. The hum stopped advancing at approximately 30 meters. It held there, not receding, not advancing, holding. The granular surface on the northern rubble line was doing its slow work, reading. And then, after a count I estimated at 40, it began to recede. Slow, even back toward the north. Not retreating. Just moving the way it moved continuously to somewhere else. 4 minutes, I made the 4th mark. 4 marks in the substrate of the composite cuff, parallel, evenly spaced, each approximately 8 millimeters. I pressed my thumb flat against all 4 of them, felt the 4 thin grooves against the pad of my thumb in sequence, 1st mark to 4th. They were there. They would be there when this was over. That thought, not quite articulated, more a background register beneath the counting, was the one that told me this was going to end. Not because I was certain of that, but because the marks were there, and they were evidence of something that had been true for 4 minutes, and evidence of something true accumulates. I counted through the 5th minute. I monitored the hum, which stayed uniform and ambient and directionless. At 5 minutes I made the 5th mark. 5 marks. 5 grooves in the rough substrate, parallel, the thumbnail width spacing between them even enough that my thumb could feel each one individually without sliding off to adjacent unmarked surface. 5 minutes, and the Vethali had been within 10 meters of us and had left, and had returned toward us once and had left again, and we were here. I gave it 2 more minutes. Not because I had a protocol for it. There was no protocol. I was inventing everything in real time. But because the 5 marks had been enough to tell me the thing was working, and I needed additional margin to tell me it was working consistently. At 7 minutes the hum was still uniform. I released the count, gradually. The way you release a tight grip when you are not certain the thing you are gripping will stay stable on its own, finger by finger. Not all at once. Then I said, still level, we are going to move now. Slow, 1 foot at a time, no rush, steady pace. Keep the count if it helps you. We moved. Casserly first because he was closest to the extraction route and because 8 years made him steady. Then me. Then Dralka, then the others. We moved back through Kethavar the way we had come back through the luminous, shadowless ruins, the pale terracotta rubble and the heavy brass daylight pouring in through the open towers. Nothing happened. The hum stayed uniform the entire way. I counted quietly, internally, not the formal 1, 2, 3 of the active encounter, but the looser continuous background count of someone who has found a rhythm and is not ready to put it down yet. I was somewhere in the high 300s when we crossed the threshold of the transit corridor, and the hum fell below perceptibility, and I let the count go, not as a decision, but as a thing that simply stopped being necessary. We held at the corridor for 11 minutes. I gave the team the time because they needed it, and because I needed it too, and the 11 minutes were as quiet as any 11 minutes I have spent in the field. Nobody spoke. Halov sat down on a piece of fallen wall and put his hands on his knees. Dorn leaned against the transit corridor's intact outer wall and stared at the middle distance. Casserly stood near me, looking back at Kethavar through the corridor's opening, and at some point he said very quietly, not asking a question, just accounting for what had happened, the counting. And I said yes. We reached the rally point at 1344 local. The full debrief began at 1500. I wore the wrist guard throughout. What the debrief confirmed, and what the xenobiologists subsequently expanded into the formal threat assessment, is available in the archived files, and I will not reproduce all of it here. The short version is that the hypothesis was correct. The Vethali's granular surface tissue functions as a distributed bioelectric sensor array tuned specifically to the pre-movement cascade, the quarter-second window of neural firing and muscular loading and cardiovascular microsurge that the body produces immediately before initiating any physical action. That window is the signal. The Vethali read it, and the Vethali respond to it, and the response is what killed the Heron Bravo team. Not their motion, their anticipation. What makes this more significant than a single incident hypothesis is the second engagement, which I want to put into this account because it is the confirmation that made the 5-mark standard a protocol rather than an anecdote. 12 days after Kethavar, a 3-person scout element under Scout Second Tier, Raniv, encountered a Vethali in the northern transit approach to the same city during a subsequent survey operation. They had been briefed on the Kethavar method, the counting, the mechanism, the 5-mark notation as a way of anchoring the count, but they had not used it in a real engagement. The encounter lasted approximately 4 minutes. The Vethali approached to within 8 meters. The 3 scouts held, counted, and the Vethali moved on. All 3 survived and completed their objective. Scout Raniv's post-engagement report contains one line that I am going to quote with her permission, because it is the most efficient confirmation I have seen of what happens inside the method. She wrote, "The counting took up all the available space and the Vethali could not find what it was looking for. That is not a clinical description. It is the accurate one. Silent integer counting, without subvocalization, without any associated physical intention. The internal generation of a number sequence with no motor plan attached to it. produces a bioelectric signature that falls below the Vethali's detection threshold for the pre-movement cascade. The xenobiologists describe it as low amplitude and metronomic, cognitive activity without motor loading, the bioelectric equivalent of a system in standby rather than a system preparing to act. The heart rate remains stable. The muscular system remains at baseline. There is no anticipation signal because there is no anticipated action. The counting occupies the cognitive space that would otherwise be generating anticipation, not by suppressing it aggressively, but by filling the space with something that has no physical consequence. There is one additional finding from the xenobiologists that I want to put in this record because it is unusual, and I think it is important. The Vethali do not appear to habituate to the absence of anticipation signals from a stationary source. That is, if a person is counting and the Vethali reads them and finds nothing, the Vethali does not then adjust its threshold or recalibrate to find the counter. It reads, finds a low-amplitude metronomic signal, and classifies it as not a target in motion. This is not a limitation that will be overcome by extended exposure. The Vethali's sensory system is not doing threat assessment. It is doing motion detection, specifically anticipatory motion detection. And if you are not producing anticipatory motion signals, you are simply not in the category the system is designed to find. You are not invisible. You are uninteresting. That distinction matters because it means the method does not have an expiration point. You can count for as long as you need to count. You do not have to not be afraid. The fear's bioelectric signature is not what the Vethali reads. You have to not be about to do something. The counting keeps you from being about to do something because you are already doing something, and the something you are doing is small and internal and produces nothing the Vethali can see. The 5 marks on the wrist guard are in this debrief room because I am submitting them to xenobiology for surface analysis. The substrate material may retain trace biological material from the thumbnail contacts, skin oils, cellular transfer, and those traces were deposited at precise 1-minute intervals during an active Vethali encounter, which makes them the most precisely documented biological sample from a Vethali proximity event currently in the archive. The xenobiologist asked for samples. These are the best ones I have. You asked me in the first debrief why I made the marks. I told you it was to anchor the count. That is true. The act of making a mark, a small, low-intensity motor action, a brief drag of the thumbnail across a substrate, produces almost no motor loading. It is not an anticipatory action. It does not signal the body's intention to perform a larger subsequent action. It is a way of putting a period on a unit of counting without starting any new intention. I made the marks to tell myself that a unit of counting was done and that the next unit was beginning, the same function a second hand serves on an analog clock. The marks were not the goal. The counting was the goal. The marks were the notation. You asked me a second question, which was why 5? I did not know it was going to be 5 until it was. I started counting because I needed to. I made the first mark when I had counted long enough that it needed marking, when something in the count felt complete the way a sentence feels complete and needed punctuation. I made the second and the third and the fourth for the same reason each time. I made the 5th mark at 5 minutes, and at 5 minutes the shape of the situation had changed enough. The Vethali had approached twice and withdrawn twice. The hum was ambient. The team was holding, that I understood we were past the part that was going to kill us. 5 was not a number I chose. 5 was the number of periods the account had before it turned. I also want to say something about what the marks did that is separate from what the counting did, because I think it is relevant to anyone who will be in the field using the method. In the middle of the 3rd minute, when the Vethali had been absent for 90 seconds and I did not know if it was coming back, the marks were the thing that kept the hypothesis credible to me. Not the counting. The counting was running on its own rhythm by then, self-sustaining, not requiring active recommitment moment to moment. What required active recommitment was the belief that the counting was still doing something useful. The marks were evidence. 2 marks down, the Vethali gone, the hum ambient, that was a data set. 3 marks down, sustained uniform hum, no advance, that was a pattern. A mark every 60 counts gave me something I could press my thumb against and feel as a physical fact. And physical facts are what discipline looks like when the situation has no protocol. I continued because the marks told me there was something to continue. The evidence held the discipline in place, and the discipline kept the team alive. That is the answer to why 5. 5 is how many periods of accumulated evidence it took for me to be certain enough that I would stake the team's continued survival on holding the method. Then I counted 2 more, for margin. I know how that sounds. I am a scout, not a philosopher, but you asked. In the days after Kethavar, I was given the standard off-rotation period, and I spent a fair amount of it in the accommodation block sitting on the edge of my bunk holding the wrist guard. Not analyzing it, not thinking about it in any technical way, just holding it with my thumb on the 5 marks, pressing them in sequence, first to fifth, fifth to first. At some point Casserly came and sat across from me and watched me do this for a while without saying anything, and then he said, "You know it worked, right? It's over." I said, "I know." He said, "So what are you still doing?" I held the wrist guard for a moment. I said, "I'm not counting, I'm just touching them." He looked at me for a moment the way scouts look at things they have classified and found not to be threats, which is a specific kind of settled attention. Then he nodded once and left me to it. The marks are 5 short grooves in the rough substrate of a composite armor cuff. Each one is approximately 8 millimeters long. They are parallel. They are evenly spaced. They were carved with a human thumbnail in approximately real time during a 9-minute encounter with a Vethali perception hunter in a daylit ruined city on Kashul IV. 1 mark per minute, as a way of keeping count without losing count. And they are the record of 5 minutes in which the most dangerous thing in Kethavar read us and found nothing and moved on. The formal recommendation I am making at the close of this account is that silent integer counting be incorporated into the standard Vethali encounter protocol as the primary behavioral countermeasure for stationary personnel in active threat range. The method requires no equipment. It requires no training beyond the instruction itself and 1 sentence of explanation. Count slowly, internally, without any number as a target, and keep counting for as long as the threat is in sensory range. It does not require the suppression of fear. It does not require a meditative state or controlled breathing or any physical discipline beyond the maintenance of stillness that the situation already demands. It requires only that you count, and that you trust the counting to be doing something, and that you keep doing it until it is no longer necessary. I recommend the protocol carry the notation of its first field verification. I recommend it be called the 5-mark standard. Not because 5 is the right number of minutes. You will count as many as you need, and the number you need will not be 5 in every case. But 5 is the number that was enough the first time, and the first time is the reason there is a protocol at all, and the record of the first time is 5 marks inside the left cuff of 1 composite armor wrist guard, submitted herewith. That is my account. I have nothing to add. You can have the wrist guard.